What happens when a mother's dignity is attacked at 30,000 feet? What happens when the whole world seems to turn against you in a cramped airplane cabin? For Dr. Aliyah Vance and her 8-year-old son Marcus, a routine flight from Chicago to San Francisco was about to become a battleground for respect, decency, and justice. They were outnumbered and outvoiced until one person spoke up. Not a lawyer, not a pilot, not another passenger, but the 8-year-old boy himself. And what he said next didn't just defend his mother, it silenced an entire airplane and turned a moment of ugly prejudice into a stunning display of genius that no one, not the captain, not the crew, and certainly not the woman who started it all, would ever forget. This is the story of how a child's love became a mother's ultimate defense. The air in the terminal at O'Hare International was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rolling thunder of suitcases, the staccato announcements of gate changes, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, blending into a single human hum. For Dr. Aliyah Vance, it was just background noise. Her focus was on the small hand, firmly clasped in hers, and the mop of tight curls that bobbed alongside her as they navigated the river of travelers. Her son Marcus wasn't like other 8-year-olds. While his peers might have been glued to a tablet game or whining for snacks, Marcus was absorbing the world with an unnerving, quiet intensity. His dark, intelligent eyes darted from the digital departures board to the intricate latticework of the terminal ceiling, to the weary faces of the people rushing past. He was a sponge for details, a silent collector of information. Flight 732 to San Francisco is now boarding at Gate K-12 Zones 1 and 2. A voice chirped over the intercom. "That's us, sweetie." Aliyah said, her voice a warm, low melody. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag on her shoulder. It was heavy, filled with her laptop, a medical journal she had no real hope of reading, and Marcus's current obsession, a thick paperback book titled The Layman's Guide to American Law. It was an odd choice for a child, but Marcus had devoured it just as he had devoured books on astrophysics, Roman architecture, and marine biology. Aliyah, a pediatrician herself, believed in nurturing curiosity, no matter how esoteric. They were in Zone 2. As they joined the line, Aliyah felt a familiar low-grade tension begin to coil in her stomach. Air travel for a black woman and her son was often an exercise in navigating unspoken biases. The suspicious glances at her, "Carry on." The surprise in a gate agent's eyes when she presented her first-class research conference invitation. The subtle way people clutched their belongings a little tighter as she passed. She'd learned to armor herself with a placid smile and an unshakable grace. They shuffled forward. Ahead of them, a couple bickered in hushed, sharp tones. The woman with a helmet of blonde hair and a face tight with displeasure clutched a designer handbag like a shield. Her husband, a man with a perpetually apologetic slump to his shoulders, mumbled placating words that seemed to have no effect. "I just don't see why they can't manage a simple pre-boarding for diamond status," the woman hissed loud enough for those around them to hear. "The whole system is falling apart, Robert." "It's just a few minutes, Caroline." Robert sighed, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Aliyah mentally named them Caroline and Robert Hedge. She had a knack for it, creating little backstories for the strangers she encountered. It was a coping mechanism, a way to turn potential antagonists into characters in a story she controlled. Finally, they were shuffling down the jet bridge. The recycled air of the plane, cool and tasting of disinfectant, enveloped them. Their seats were 12B and 12C an aisle, and a middle in the economy comfort section. Aliyah was grateful for the small mercy of extra leg room. She slid her tote bag under the seat in front of her, making sure Marcus's precious law book was secure. Marcus, with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer, buckled his seatbelt and immediately pulled the laminated safety card from the seat-back pocket, studying it with the same focus he gave his books. That's when the Hedges arrived. Caroline stopped short in the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning the seat numbers. Her gaze landed on Aaliyah and Marcus, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. "I believe you're in our seats." Aaliyah pulled out her phone, the boarding passes glowing on the screen. "Hi there. I have 12B and 12C right here." She offered a polite, non-confrontational smile. Caroline Hedge leaned in, peering at the phone, then at her own paper ticket, then back at Aaliyah. "Well, that can't be right. Robert, show them." Robert fumbled with his ticket. "Ah, yes, dear. We're 12A and—" "Oh," he paused. "We're 12A and 12D." The window and the opposite aisle. They had booked 2 separate aisle seats, a common strategy for couples hoping the middle seats would remain empty. Today their gamble hadn't paid off. Caroline's lips thinned into a razor line. The problem was not Aaliyah, but her own booking. Yet her frustration remained squarely aimed at the people already sitting there. "Well," she said, her voice loud and carrying, "isn't that just ridiculous? An aisle and a window. What were you thinking, Robert?" She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she looked directly at Aaliyah. "Would you mind moving? My husband and I would like to sit together." It wasn't a request. It was a demand cloaked in the thinnest veil of politeness. Aaliyah's internal armor clicked into place. She knew this dance. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her tone even. "But my son is 8, and I need to be seated next to him. We can't really move." Caroline let out an exasperated sigh. "Of course. Look, how about this? You," she pointed a manicured finger at Marcus, "can sit in my husband's seat across the aisle. It's right there. You can see your mother perfectly fine. And he," she gestured to Robert, "can sit here." Aaliyah felt a flash of heat. The casual way Caroline proposed separating her from her child was dismissive and presumptuous. "No, thank you," Aaliyah said, her voice a little firmer now. "The airline's own policy recommends children under 13 be seated with a guardian. He's staying right here." From the corner of her eye, she saw Marcus place the safety card back in its pocket. His small hands were folded in his lap. He was watching, listening. His silence was not one of fear, but of analysis. Caroline Hedge now dropped all pretense of civility. "For heaven's sake," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's not like he's a toddler. He's a big boy. It's just across the aisle. Some people are just so—" She trailed off, but her disdainful glare finished the sentence. "Inflexible, difficult, selfish." Other passengers, still trying to find their seats, were beginning to look. A flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, with a harried expression, started to make her way down the aisle. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her gaze flicking between Caroline and Aaliyah. "Yes," Caroline said imperiously. "This woman is refusing to move so I can sit with my husband. We are diamond status flyers." She presented the status as if it were a legal decree. Before the flight attendant could respond, Aaliyah spoke calmly and clearly. "We are in our assigned seats, 12B and 12C. This passenger has seats 12A and 12D. She is asking me to separate from my 8-year-old child, and I've declined." The flight attendant, clearly wanting to avoid a confrontation, looked at Caroline. Ma'am, the other passenger is correct. I can't force her to move. Perhaps I could ask another passenger to switch with your husband. I don't want to ask another passenger. Caroline's voice was now verging on a screech. I want these seats. It's just a simple swap. The situation was spiraling. Aaliyah could feel the stares of the other passengers, some sympathetic, some annoyed that the boarding process was being held up. She just wanted to disappear, to fold herself and Marcus away from this ugly, unnecessary spotlight. Caroline, please. Robert mumbled, his face turning a blotchy red. Let's just take our seats. It's fine. It is not fine, she retorted. She then turned her eyes, narrowed with venom, back to Aaliyah. You know this is what's wrong with the world, the entitlement. People just think they can do whatever they want. The hypocrisy was so staggering, it was almost comical. Aaliyah felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in her throat, but forced it down. She simply looked at Caroline, held her gaze and said nothing. Her silence, her refusal to be drawn into the mud, seemed to enrage Caroline even more. Defeated for the moment, Caroline angrily gestured for Robert to take his seat, 12D. Then, with a great dramatic huff, she began trying to shove her oversized designer purse into the overhead bin above Aaliyah and Marcus. It was clearly too large. This is unbelievable, she muttered, yanking at it. Nothing, ever, works. Finally, she gave up. With a frustrated groan, she pulled the bag down. She looked at the floor space by her window seat, 12A. It was cramped. She looked at the space under the seat in front of Aaliyah. Without asking, she reached down and began to shove her purse under the seat in front of Aaliyah's, pushing against Aaliyah's own tote bag. Excuse me, Aaliyah said, her patience finally snapping. What are you doing? You can't put your bag in my foot space. Oh, for pity's sake, there's room, Caroline snapped, ramming the bag forward. Just move your feet. No, Aaliyah said, her voice cold as ice. That is my space. I have my own bag there. Move your purse. A tense silence fell. The two women were locked in a silent battle of wills. Caroline red-faced and furious. Aaliyah composed but radiating a do-not-push-me-further energy. Slowly, resentfully, Caroline pulled her bag out. She glared at Aaliyah one last time before squeezing past the other passengers to take her window seat. Effectively trapping the person in 12B Aaliyah. She stuffed her purse under the seat in front of her with a series of angry jabs. The flight attendant, Sarah, gave Aaliyah a weak, apologetic smile and continued down the aisle. The crisis, it seemed, was averted. The cabin door was closed, the safety demonstration began, and the plane started its slow taxi to the runway. Aaliyah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She turned to Marcus. You okay, my love? Marcus looked at her, his expression serious. Her booking was illogical, he said, his voice soft but clear. She should have selected Sit Together on the website's interface. The system would have assigned adjacent seats. Aaliyah almost smiled. Trust Marcus to find the logical flaw in the human drama. You're right, baby. She made a mistake. She was also rude, Marcus added, a hint of steel in his tone. Her syllogism was false. She claimed we were entitled, but she was the one demanding something she had no right to. Aaliyah squeezed his hand. My little lawyer, let's just try to have a peaceful flight, okay? We'll watch a movie. She settled back, trying to let the tension drain away as the plane rumbled down the runway and lifted into the sky. She put on her headphones, a shield against the world, and tried to focus on the clouds. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She could feel Caroline Hedge's angry energy radiating from 2 seats away. An hour into the flight, the fragile calm was shattered for good. The flight attendants were serving drinks. Caroline, who had already had 2 small bottles of wine, was rummaging through her things. Her movements became more and more frantic. "My wallet," she said, her voice initially a panicked whisper. Then it grew louder. "My wallet. It's gone." She stood up as much as one can stand in a crowded plane and started patting down her seat, her pockets. Robert tried to calm her down. "Caroline, I'm sure it's in your purse." "I've looked in my purse," she shrieked, and this time there was no mistaking the venom and accusation in her voice as she turned and stared directly at Aaliyah. "I looked a dozen times. It was there when we boarded. I know it was." She took a step into the aisle, her body angled towards Aaliyah and Marcus. "But then," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, poisonous level that everyone in the surrounding rows could hear, "I had that distraction, that argument, when I had to put my bag down." Her eyes locked onto Aaliyah. "Someone took it," she declared, "and I think I know who." Every head in a 5-row radius turned. The accusation hung in the air, thick, ugly, and unmistakable. It was aimed directly at Dr. Aaliyah Vance and her 8-year-old son. The real drama had just begun. The hum of the engines seemed to fade into an unnerving silence. In its place, the sound of Aaliyah's own heartbeat thudded in her ears. The world, which a moment ago had been 30,000 feet of suspended normalcy, had shrunk to the space of a few airplane rows, charged with a poison that was all too terrestrial. Caroline Hedge stood in the aisle, a portrait of righteous indignation. Her finger wasn't pointing, but her eyes were daggers pinning Aaliyah to her seat. The insinuation was as clear as if she had screamed it. The distraction, the argument, the proximity, the unspoken ugly variable in Caroline's equation race. "Ma'am." The flight attendant, Sarah, hurried over, her face pale. "Please, let's not jump to conclusions. What exactly is missing?" "My wallet." Caroline's voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin's murmur. "My Louis Vuitton wallet. It had all my cards, my ID, $500 in cash. It was in my purse. I checked it before we boarded. Now it's gone." She stared hard at Aaliyah. "The only time my bag was out of my sight was over here, during our little disagreement." Aaliyah felt a cold fury rise within her, so potent it threatened to choke her. For years she had navigated the world with a carefully constructed shield of grace. As a pediatrician in a predominantly white, affluent suburb, she'd faced the subtle questioning of her credentials, the surprise on parents' faces when Dr. Vance turned out to be a black woman. She had learned to de-escalate, to educate through excellence, to prove her worth over and over again without ever showing the exhaustion it caused. But this was different. This wasn't a microaggression. This was a public branding, a scarlet letter of suspicion painted on her in front of a captive audience. And worse, it was being painted on her son. She looked at Marcus. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were wide, taking in every detail, the accusing glare from Caroline, the flight attendant's panicked expression, the curious, judgmental faces of the passengers peering over their seats. He was absorbing this poison, and the thought of it curdled Aaliyah's blood. "I can assure you," Aaliyah said, her voice dangerously calm, "that we have not touched your belongings. I suggest you check your purse again, thoroughly." "I have checked," Caroline scoffed. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" "It's gone." Robert Hedge, his face a mess of perspiration and shame, tugged at his wife's arm. Caroline, for God's sake, sit down. You're making a scene. They stole from me. Robert, are you going to just sit there? She screeched, shaking him off. She then turned her attention to Sarah, the flight attendant. You need to do something. Search them. Search their bags. The demand hung in the air, a shocking breach of protocol and decency. The cabin, which had been murmuring, fell completely silent. Even those who had been annoyed by Caroline's earlier outburst were now staring aghast. Sarah, the flight attendant, was completely out of her depth. Her training manual had no chapter for this. Ma'am, I can't just search another passenger. That's not something we can do. So you're going to let them get away with it? Caroline pressed her voice, reaching a hysterical pitch. This is a crime. I want the captain. I want the police to meet us when we land. Aliyah knew she had to take control. This was no longer about a wallet. It was about her and her son's dignity and safety. To be accused of theft on a plane could have serious repercussions. It could mean being detained, questioned, and humiliated upon landing. That will be enough, Aliyah said, her voice ringing with an authority that made several people, including Sarah, flinch. She was no longer just a passenger. She was Dr. Aliyah Vance, a woman who commanded respect in operating rooms and consultation suites, and that woman was now present in row 12. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her tall, slender frame seeming to take up all the space in the aisle. She was eye to eye with Caroline Hedge. You have made a very serious, very public, and completely baseless accusation against me and my child. Aliyah said, her words precise and cold. Before this goes any further, you will take your purse, you will place it on your lap, and you will empty every single item out of it, here, in front of all of us. Caroline sputtered, taken aback by the command. I'm not going to. You will. Aliyah interrupted, her voice unyielding. Because you have created this public spectacle, so you will finish it publicly, or I will be the one demanding the captain, and I will be the one speaking to law enforcement when we land about a case of public defamation and harassment. The word defamation seemed to land with physical weight. It was a clear, legal-sounding term that shifted the dynamic. It wasn't just a squabble anymore. From his seat, Marcus watched his mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. He saw her strength, her fire, but he also saw the subtle tremor in her hands. He saw the cost of her courage. Robert Hedge, seeing the tide turn, began frantically whispering to his wife, "Caroline, just do it! For God's sake, just look in the bag one more time!" Cornered and furious, Caroline snatched her purse from her seat. With jerky, angry movements, she upended it onto her lap. A cascade of items spilled out: a makeup bag, a tangle of charging cords, a crumpled itinerary, a hairbrush, a phone. She rummaged through the pile with a theatrical fury. "It's not here, I told you, it's not—" And then she stopped. Her hand froze. Wedged deep in a side pocket, almost completely hidden by the fabric lining, was the corner of a familiar brown and gold patterned leather. Her Louis Vuitton wallet. A collective sick seemed to ripple through the nearby rows. Robert Hedge buried his face in his hands. The silence that followed was more damning than any shout could have been. Caroline Hedge stared at the wallet as if it had personally betrayed her. The evidence of her own folly, her own prejudice, was sitting in her lap for everyone to see. Aliyah expected an apology, a profuse, shame-faced, immediate apology. What she got was far, far worse. Caroline slowly, deliberately put the wallet back in her purse. She avoided looking at Aliyah. She avoided looking at anyone. She looked at the seat in front of her and spoke to the fabric. "Well," she said, her voice a low, stubborn mumble. "With all that commotion earlier, they probably just moved it. As a distraction. it's still their fault for upsetting me. It was a twist of logic so perverse, so breathtakingly arrogant, that Alia was momentarily speechless. There was no apology, no remorse. Just a doubling down, a pathetic attempt to reframe the narrative, to absolve herself of all blame. She was casting Alia and Marcus not as the victims of her false accusation, but as the architects of her confusion. And that, for Alia, was the final straw. The armor of grace didn't just crack, it shattered. The exhaustion of a lifetime of such encounters, big and small, flooded through her. Her strength wavered. She sank back into her seat, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a hollow, aching weariness. The fight had gone out of her. The injustice of it all, the accusation, the public humiliation, and now the complete lack of accountability, was a weight too heavy to bear. She put her head in her hands, not crying, but just defeated. And it was in that moment of his mother's surrender that Marcus Johnson decided to act. He had been watching, processing, connecting the dots with the dispassionate logic he applied to his books. He had heard the words, "search them," "stole from me," defamation. He had seen the accusation, the discovery of the wallet, and the shocking refusal to apologize. He had seen his strong, brilliant mother, the woman who could diagnose rare childhood illnesses and calm a screaming infant with a touch crumble. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up on his seat, his small frame suddenly visible over the seatbacks. He looked at Caroline Hedge, who was still pointedly ignoring them. He looked at the flustered flight attendant. He looked at the curious faces of the passengers. Then, in a voice that was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of childishness, he spoke. "My mother is Dr. Alia Vance." He began the words, dropping into the quiet cabin like stones into a still pond. "She's a pediatrician. She saves children's lives. She doesn't steal." He paused, letting that sink in. "You accused her of a felony. Grand larceny in some states, depending on the value of the wallet's contents." He continued, his tone matter of fact. "You did it in front of at least 20 witnesses. When you were proven wrong, you did not apologize. Instead, you committed a second offense." Caroline Hedge slowly turned her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Was this child lecturing her? You slandered her," Marcus stated. "Slander is the spoken form of defamation. It's when you say something untrue about someone to a third party and it harms their reputation. You did that. You harmed her reputation, and you caused her severe emotional distress." He wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Sarah, the flight attendant. "You are a representative of this airline," he said with an unnerving command. "The airline has a contract of carriage with my mother. I read it online. It's a legally binding agreement. It states that the airline is responsible for the safety and well-being of its passengers. Your passenger, Mrs. Hedge, has verbally assaulted and harassed my mother. You witnessed it. By failing to stop it, and by failing to take out action after her false accusation, the airline is failing to meet its obligation under the contract." He took a breath. His small chest rose and fell. "My mother is the victim here," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "She has been falsely accused publicly, humiliated and slandered. And we are not okay. This is not a safe environment for us. I believe the captain needs to be informed of this situation, immediately." A stunned, absolute silence descended upon the cabin of Flight 732. Jaws were literally hanging open. Passengers looked at each other, then at the 8-year-old boy standing on the seat, then at his mother, who was now staring at her son with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The legal genius of Marcus Johnson had just been unleashed, and nothing on this flight would ever be the same. For a long moment, the only sound was the omnipresent drone of the Rolls-Royce engines, a sound that had been background noise, but now felt like the world holding its breath. Passengers who had been half asleep or lost in movies had taken off their headphones. Everyone was looking. They had witnessed the ugly accusation and the stunning discovery of the wallet. But what they were witnessing now was something else entirely. Something that defied easy explanation. An 8-year-old boy standing on an airplane seat had just articulated a legal and contractual argument with more clarity and precision than most adults could muster. He had used terms like grand larceny, slander, defamation, emotional distress, and contract of carriage. He hadn't just recited words, he had applied them correctly and devastatingly to the situation at hand. Dr. Aaliyah Vance stared at her son. The weariness that had crushed her just moments before was replaced by a tidal wave of astonishment and a fierce, surging pride that was so intense it made her dizzy. Where had this come from? The law book, yes. The countless hours spent reading, yes. But this was different. This was synthesis. This was the application of knowledge under extreme pressure. This was brilliance. Caroline Hedges' face had gone from red with anger to a pasty, sickly white. The smugness, the entitlement, the righteous indignation, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a slack-jawed confusion. She was being intellectually dismantled by a child, and she had no defense. It was Surah, the flight attendant, who finally broke the spell. She was staring at Marcus as if he were an apparition. You, she stammered, utterly flummoxed. She was trained to handle disruptive passengers' medical emergencies and security threats. Her manual had absolutely nothing on prodigy child litigating a defamation claim mid-flight. He's right, a voice suddenly boomed from across the aisle. Heads swiveled. The voice belonged to a man in his late 50s, seated in 12F. He was dressed in a simple but well-tailored travel blazer, with graying temples and a calm, authoritative demeanor. He had been watching the entire exchange with a keen, analytical interest. "The boy is absolutely right," the man repeated, looking at Sarah. "You have a passenger who has been falsely accused of a crime in public by another passenger. The accuser was proven wrong and then astonishingly refused to apologize and instead cast further blame. That constitutes harassment. The airline has a duty of care. By any reasonable standard, that duty has been breached. The captain absolutely needs to be notified. This is now a liability issue for your airline." If Marcus's words had been a stunning opening statement, this was the expert witness testimony that cemented it. The man spoke with an easy confidence that suggested this was his world. Sarah, the flight attendant, nodded, grabbing onto the man's words like a lifeline. "Yes, of course, right away." This was language she understood: liability, duty of care, captain. She practically fled down the aisle toward the front of the plane, speaking urgently into the cabin phone. The focus now shifted. It was no longer just about the Hedges versus the Vances. It was about the official response. Robert Hedge was now pleading with his wife in a frantic whisper. "Caroline, apologize to her. Right now. Apologize." But Caroline seemed frozen, trapped in a state of mortified paralysis. To apologize now would be to admit defeat not just to Aaliyah, but to the child who had so thoroughly and publicly outmaneuvered her. Aaliyah finally found her voice. She gently pulled on Marcus's shirt. "Okay, baby, you can sit down now." Marcus looked at his mother, the fierce legal advocate persona melting away to reveal the 8-year-old boy beneath. Is she going to say she's sorry? He asked, his voice now small and vulnerable. I don't know, sweetheart. Aaliyah whispered, her heart aching. But you were so brave. I am so proud of you. She pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his curls, inhaling the familiar scent of his shampoo. She was holding on to him, but it felt like he was the one holding her up. A few minutes later, 2 figures appeared at the front of the aisle. Sarah looking relieved to have handed off the problem, and a man with silver hair and a calm, no-nonsense face that radiated command. The 4 stripes on his epaulets identified him instantly. Captain David Miller. He walked down the aisle with a steady, purposeful gait, the sea of passengers parting for him. He didn't stop at Caroline Hedges' seat. He walked directly to row 12 and stopped, his body angled to address both Aaliyah and Marcus. His eyes, however, were on Marcus. Young man. Captain Miller began, his voice a deep baritone that was used to being obeyed. My flight attendant informed me of the situation. She told me you had some things to say. Marcus, now sitting, looked up at the towering figure of the captain. He nodded. Yes, sir. She mentioned you spoke about the contract of carriage, the captain said, a note of incredulity in his voice. Yes, sir. Marcus repeated. Section 7, subsection C. Passenger conduct. It says the airline can refuse to transport or can remove from the aircraft any passenger who interferes with the duties of a crew member or whose conduct is disorderly, abusive, or violent. And Section 9, airline liability. It says the airline is responsible for proven damages. Captain Miller stared at Marcus. He had been flying for 30 years. He had dealt with every conceivable type of in-flight incident. This was a first. He slowly crouched down in the aisle, bringing himself closer to eye level with the boy. It was a gesture of respect. And you believe, the captain said gently, that Mrs. Hedges' conduct was abusive. She called my mom a thief in front of everyone, Marcus said simply, and then she wouldn't say sorry. It hurt my mom's feelings, and it wasn't true. The complex legal argument was stripped away, leaving the raw human truth. It hurt my mom's feelings, and it wasn't true. That more than anything seemed to land with the captain. Captain Miller looked at Aaliyah. He saw the exhaustion on her face, the lingering pain in her eyes, and the fierce pride she had for her son. He saw a respected professional who had been subjected to a degrading and humiliating ordeal. Vance, he said, reading her name from the passenger manifest he held. On behalf of this airline, and as the captain of this aircraft, I want to offer you my most sincere and profound apology for what you and your son have experienced on this flight. This is completely unacceptable. His apology was direct, unambiguous, and sincere. Aaliyah felt a knot of tension she hadn't even realized was there begin to dissolve. She simply nodded, unable to speak. The captain then stood up and turned his attention to Caroline Hedge. His demeanor shifted. The gentle inquisitor was gone, replaced by the commander of a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and everyone on it. Mrs. Hedge, he said, his voice now cold and hard as granite. I have been fully briefed on your actions. You initiated a confrontation over seating. You then made a false and inflammatory accusation of theft against another passenger. When your own error was discovered, you failed to apologize and instead continued your harassment. You have created a hostile environment, distressed multiple passengers, and interfered with the duties of my crew. You have, by the definition you heard moments ago, from this child, violated the terms of the contract of carriage. Caroline Hedge shrank in her seat, every trace of her earlier haughtiness gone. It was a mistake. I was upset, she stammered. Your emotional state is not an excuse for your behavior. Captain Miller cut her off. Behavior has consequences. We have 2 hours until we land in San Francisco. For the remainder of this flight, you will not speak to or interact with Dr. Vance or her son in any way. You will not cause any further disruption. When we land, you will remain in your seat until you are met by airline security and a customer relations manager. They will escort you off this plane. Is that understood? The threat was clear. She wasn't just being scolded. She was being officially detained, pending review on the ground. Yes, Caroline whispered, her face pale. Robert looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The captain wasn't finished. He turned back to Aaliyah and Marcus. Dr. Vance, I cannot undo the distress this has caused, but I will not have you spend the rest of this flight in this environment. We have 2 open seats in first class. My lead flight attendant will escort you and your son there now. Please gather your things. It was a gesture, but a powerful one. A clear and public validation of who was the victim and who was the aggressor. It was a restoration of dignity. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Captain. As she and Marcus gathered their tote bag and his small backpack, a strange thing happened. A quiet ripple of applause started in the rows around them. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but a soft, sustained clapping. It was a verdict. The passengers had seen everything, and they were delivering their judgment. They were applauding the captain's decisive action. They were applauding Aaliyah's resilience. But most of all, they were applauding the small boy with the big brain and the even bigger heart who had stood up for his mother when no one else would. The man in 12F, the one who had backed up Marcus's claims, caught Aaliyah's eye as she stepped into the aisle. He gave her a small, respectful nod. Your son, he said, his voice low and full of admiration, is one of a kind. You must be incredibly proud. You have no idea. Aaliyah said, her voice thick with emotion. As she and Marcus walked toward the front of the plane, following the flight attendant, Marcus looked back. He saw Caroline hedge, her head bowed in humiliation. He saw her husband staring blankly at the seat back in front of him. He saw the faces of strangers now smiling at him with warmth and respect. He had taken a moment of ugliness and, using the tools he had learned from his books, transformed it into a moment of justice. In the courtroom of Flight 732, the 8-year-old from row 12 had won his case. The first-class cabin was a world away from the cramped tensions of economy. The seats were cocoons of leather and privacy. The air felt calmer, the light softer. A flight attendant, a different one, with a warm, empathetic face, greeted them with quiet deference. Dr. Vance Marcus, she said softly. Welcome. Can I get you anything? A warm towel, orange juice, a glass of champagne for you, doctor. Aaliyah, still feeling emotionally raw, managed a weak smile. Just some water would be wonderful. Thank you. And maybe some apple juice for Marcus. She sank into the plush seat, the sheer relief of it all washing over her. She watched Marcus as he explored the seat's functions with wide-eyed curiosity, his fingers tracing the buttons that controlled the recline and the leg rest. For a moment, he was just a little boy again, fascinated by a new toy. The fierce, articulate advocate had receded, but Aaliyah knew he was still there, just beneath the surface. She looked at her son, this incredible, impossible child. The pride was still there, a burning star in her chest, but it was now mingled with a new worry. What did this mean for him? To have to be so strong, so young. To have to wield words like slander and liability to defend his own mother. A part of her celebrated his genius, while another part grieved the loss of an innocence he shouldn't have had to shed at 30,000 feet. As they settled in, the flight attendant who had escorted them forward discreetly handed Aaliyah a business card. "The gentleman in seat 12F asked me to give this to you," she whispered. Aaliyah took the card. It was thick, expensive card stock, elegantly printed. Benjamin Carter, Senior Partner. Carter Dunn and Associates, specialists in civil rights and corporate litigation. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. Civil rights. It wasn't just a random man who had spoken up. It was an expert, a senior partner at what she could only assume was a major law firm. This man hadn't just been offering an opinion. He had been providing a professional assessment. He had recognized the legal legitimacy of Marcus's argument instantly. The full weight of the situation settled on her. Marcus hadn't just sounded smart. He had, in essence, presented a case that a top civil rights attorney had immediately validated. The rest of the flight passed in a surreal, quiet bubble. Marcus drank his apple juice and eventually fell asleep, his head resting on Aaliyah's arm, his face finally relaxed and peaceful. Aaliyah held Benjamin Carter's card in her hand, turning it over and over. It felt like a key, though she wasn't yet sure what door it unlocked. When the plane finally touched down in San Francisco, a palpable sense of finality filled the air. As the first-class passengers began to deboard, Captain Miller appeared at the cabin door. He addressed Aaliyah directly. "Dr. Vance, I just wanted to let you know that a gate supervisor, Ms. Jenkins, is waiting for you on the jet bridge. She is here to personally escort you through the terminal and assist with your baggage and transportation. We have also, of course, fully refunded the cost of your tickets and added a significant number of miles to both of your accounts as a more formal apology from the airline." "Captain, that's very generous. Thank you," Aaliyah said, genuinely touched by the thoroughness of the response. "It's the least we can do," he said. Then he looked down at the now waking Marcus. "And as for you, young man," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips, "I have a feeling I'll be reading about you one day. Just try to stay on our side, okay?" Marcus scrubbed the sleep from his eyes and gave the captain a small, shy smile. "Okay." As they stepped onto the jet bridge, they saw the scene they had left behind. The economy passengers were being held on the plane. Standing near the door were two uniformed airport security officers and a stern-looking woman in an airline blazer, presumably the manager who was waiting for Caroline Hedge. Justice, or at least corporate procedure, was being served. Waiting for them as promised was a kind-faced woman who introduced herself as Maria Jenkins. She led them away from the crowd, her presence a shield against any further stares or questions. As they walked through the bustling terminal, a familiar voice called out, "Dr. Vance." Aaliyah turned to see Benjamin Carter approaching them. He had a carry-on roller bag and a briefcase, looking every bit the high-powered lawyer. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his smile warm. "I just wanted to speak to you both for a moment, if that's all right." "Of course, Mr. Carter," Aaliyah said. "I wanted to thank you. Your support back there. It meant a great deal." "It was my pleasure," he said. "And my professional obligation. What I witnessed was appalling." He then crouched down just as the captain had to look Marcus in the eye. "Marcus," he said, his tone serious but kind. "My name is Ben. I've been a lawyer for 35 years. I've argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. And I want you to know I have never in my life seen a more effective, succinct, and brilliant legal argument than the one you made today." Marcus shuffled his feet, suddenly shy. "I just read it in a book." "No," Ben Carter said, shaking his head. Lots of people read books. What you did was different. You understood the principles. You saw an injustice, and you applied the principles to correct it. That is the very soul of the law. It's a gift. He stood up and looked at Aaliyah. Dr. Vance, what that woman did was actionable. The public accusation, the clear racial animus, the distress it caused. It's a textbook defamation case. The airline is moving to protect itself, but you have a personal case against her, should you choose to pursue it. Aaliyah looked at her son, then back at the lawyer. Honestly, Mr. Carter, I don't have the energy for a lawsuit. I just want to put this behind us. I understand completely, he said with an empathetic nod. But the world needs to be held accountable for this kind of behavior. People like Caroline Hedge count on their victims being too tired or too intimidated to fight back. He paused. My firm would be honored to represent you pro bono, of course. Not for a big payday, but to get a formal court-ordered apology from her. To have a legal record that states what she did was wrong. Sometimes that's the only victory that matters. His words hung in the air. It was a tempting offer, not for revenge, but for a sense of cosmic justice. But before Aaliyah could answer, another twist in the day's drama unfolded. From the direction of the gate they heard a commotion. A woman was sobbing loud, gut-wrenching boo. It was Caroline Hedge being flanked by the security officers and the gate supervisor. Her husband, Robert, trailed behind, looking utterly broken. As they passed, Caroline looked up, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara. She saw Aaliyah Marcus and Benjamin Carter standing together. Her expression wasn't one of anger anymore. It was one of complete and utter despair. Through her sobs, she choked out a few words that were clearly not meant for them, but for the supervisor. My sister. She's in hospice. The doctors said she only had hours. I wasn't thinking straight. Her words trailed off into another wave of racking sobs as they moved her along. The revelation landed with a quiet thud. It wasn't an excuse. It could never excuse the prejudice, the venom, the false accusation. But it was a reason. A piece of the story they didn't have. A woman crazed with grief and stress flying to her sister's deathbed, her world already falling apart before she ever stepped on the plane. Her terrible entitled behavior now had a tragic underpinning. It was the lashing out of a person in immense pain directed at the most convenient target. Aaliyah looked at Benjamin Carter, whose face was unreadable. She looked at Marcus, who was watching the retreating, sobbing woman with an expression of deep concentration. He wasn't gloating. He was analyzing this new piece of information. She was in pain, Marcus said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. That's why her actions were erratic. Hearing that from her son, after everything he had endured at the hands of that woman, solidified Aaliyah's decision. Revenge felt petty now. A lawsuit felt like pouring salt on a wound that was already festering with grief. She turned to Benjamin Carter. Thank you for the incredibly generous offer, Mr. Carter, but I think the captain's actions, the airline's response, and frankly what my son did, that's enough justice for one day. Ben Carter looked from Aaliyah to Marcus, and a slow, deep smile spread across his face. You know what, Dr. Vance, he said. I think you're absolutely right. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a different card, a personal one with just his name, email, and private cell number. He handed it not to Aaliyah, but to Marcus. Marcus, he said, that gift you have, it needs to be nurtured. When you're a little older, if you ever want to talk about the law, or visit a real courtroom, or just ask questions, I want you to call me. Any time. The world is going to need men like you." Marcus took the card, his small fingers closing around it as if it were a medal. He looked up at the powerful lawyer, then at his mother, and then back at the card. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a signpost pointing toward a future he had never imagined, a future forged in the crucible of Flight 732. The day had started as a trial, but it was ending with a mentorship. A new, unexpected chapter was about to begin. In the end, justice wasn't found in a courtroom, but in the decisive actions of a captain who chose integrity over convenience. It was found in the validation of a top civil rights lawyer who saw brilliance in the unexpected, and it was found in a mother's decision to choose compassion over condemnation, even for the person who had wronged her so deeply. But most of all, it was found in the voice of an 8-year-old boy. Marcus Johnson didn't just defend his mother. He elevated everyone around him. He reminded a plane load of strangers that knowledge is power, that logic can defeat prejudice, and that courage doesn't have a minimum age requirement. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that heroes come in all sizes, and that sometimes the most profound strength is found in the love between a parent and a child. It's a reminder that even in our darkest, most unjust moments, a single voice speaking the truth can change everything. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of hope and courage. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will inspire and stay with you long after you've watched. Thank you for listening.